John Webb made his mark as a creative artist in advertising, as a cartoonist, as a brass wind collector, as a writer on brass instruments, and as an instrument maker. I first met John in 1981, a time when his brass wind collection was growing rapidly. The hospitality in his West London house was generous, to say the least, and his collection immediately made a big impression. There have been many aspects to my involvement with the John Webb collection. Indeed, latterly Webb joked that I knew his collection better than he did. His collecting started in a small way in the 1960s, when his advertising work took him to Amsterdam, where he played jazz trumpet in nightclubs. Collecting moved into an obsessive phase in the late 1970s and early 1980s. By the end of 1981, he had amassed 131 woodwind instruments and 61 brass wind instruments. He came to regret the woodwind acquisitions and to concentrate on brass. It was in November 1981 that he acquired the finest and most expensive piece in his collection, the hallmarked silver slide trumpet by John Augustus Curler, formerly belonging to Thomas Harper Jr., with original mouthpieces and case. For this he paid over £2,500 at Sotheby's, a considerable sum at that date. This purchase not only signalled the significance of his collection, but was also a statement of his purchasing power, which few brass collectors in Europe could compete with. In the initial period of collecting, his motivation seems to have been curiosity, and the returns on his investment to have been interest and delight. As Webb grew more confident in his knowledge and powers of observation, he became an active member of the Galpin Society and started corresponding with other collectors and with scholars. Webb produced a series of short articles drawing on his research into his collection, mostly for the Galpin Society Journal. He also lent brass instruments to exhibitions and began to attract research visits to his collection. The second phase of collection building lasted through the 1980s and concentrated exclusively on brass instruments, mostly 19th century. Indeed, Webb actively disposed of as many as he could of the woodwinds. The brass wind acquisitions were of all kinds, French horns and valved brass, trombones and slide trumpets, and especially keyed brass. The motivation for the latter came in part from his interest in playing the antique instruments. In 1985, Webb formed a semi-professional performing group, the London Ophicleide Ensemble, in which he played ophicleide. He also played in the early Victorian brass band. By 1987, his collection included 16 keyed bugles and 14 ophicleides amongst the 300 brass instruments. Probably more significant than the activities of the London Ophicleide Ensemble were the fruits of Webb's generosity in lending instruments to professional players. These included John Wallace and other members of the Wallace collection. Their landmark Nimbus recording, The Origin of the Species, performing the Kifartha band repertoire on period instruments, was only possible because it could draw on the Webb collection. The growing collection called for appropriate accommodation. While living in London, Webb maintained Padbrook, a holiday home in the Wiltshire countryside. An extension was completed in 1985, which provided a spacious music room with showcases to display most of the instrument collection. There were 8 showcases for the brass instruments. From 1985, Webb's focus turned to instrument making. A workshop was established at Padbrook. He was self-taught, developing his techniques by repairing and making replacement parts for items in his collection in the mid-1980s. He started with English slide trumpets and went on to produce natural and keyed trumpets and sackbuts. Also French horns, which he produced in conjunction with Anthony Halstead. instrument making combined hobby and business for Webb. He discontinued work in advertising and built up the instrument making trade. In 1992, Webb hosted a meeting of the Galpin Society at Padbrook. This is a clip of him in his workshop.
Well, for bending a bell, because of the thickness of it, you use a mixture of pitch and a type of resin.
Yes.
But for all the small bows, I use this stuff, which is called Cerabend, but it's a lead alloy, which actually melts at about, I don't know, 65 degrees or something.
I see.
So you can just about hold it, even when it's melted.
You can.
And I just melted on that thing and cool it in just water, and to clean it once it's bent. Put it in a. I just do that tin there, put water in it, and literally as it gets below boiling point, it all runs out.
It doesn't contaminate the surface of the tube.
No, it's difficult. You've got to make sure you get it all out, which can be tricky because as soon as you take it out of the water, it immediately goes off anything that's left on the side. So the tube, I coat it first of all with soapy water, a bit of washing up liquid and stuff. And you have to make sure you get it all out.
You could brush it out, couldn't you?
Well, yeah, but that often doesn't do it, and sometimes I've got all sorts of pull-throughs and things like that, hard things. But sometimes you find after about a few months of an instrument being used, suddenly a little thin strip of Cerabend will come out. And of course, it can affect certain harmonics, and particularly on a horn. At least with pitch, when it melts and runs out, it does just that. It all comes out, But the Cerabend cools so quickly; it's immediate, as soon as you get it out of the boiling water. So you spend a lot of your time scalding yourself, setting fire to yourself. I've done it all. The worst thing is the wax, because to make these things, I've had masters chased up. And I make moulds, and I use a special wax, and then they coat the wax in a place in London with silver, and then you cut the ends off and melt the silver out and so on. But that's dangerous, because that wax, when it gets on, I spilled a whole saucepan over my hand, and because it doesn't come off, it just stays on there burning. And I had blisters, it makes extraordinary sight, the hands were like that. But it's a dangerous business, And almost every chemical you use is deadly poison.
Webb wrote in 1985, "Unfortunately, I have no more room for large instruments in Wiltshire. In fact, I'm thinking of getting rid of some of the tubas and helicons. I concentrate now on keyed brass and cornets and trumpets." By the early 1990s, the historic instrument collection was beginning to become irrelevant to Webb's own music making and instrument building activities. Acquisition slowed and had virtually ceased by 1994. An activity which continued to flourish was a series of visits of groups of brass instrument students from the Royal Academy of Music and other London conservatoires. Webb entered into negotiations to transfer his historic instruments to the Royal Academy of Music. However, Webb and the principal of the Academy had a big bust-up, and what might have been a good placing for the collection fell through. With the collapse of negotiations with the Royal Academy of Music, the collection entered a period of neglect and depletion. Most of the instruments remained in their custom-made showcases in Padbrook, but Webb's scholarly publications ceased, and the collection was irrelevant to his instrument making. By the time the instruments were packed up in 2012, they had lost their shine, were covered with cobwebs, and one or two had been adorned with bird droppings. In 2002, John Wallace, formerly head of brass at the Royal Academy of Music, was appointed principal at the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama, now the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, in Glasgow. The fruitful cooperation which had developed between Webb and Wallace naturally led to the suggestion the instrument collection could move north to Glasgow. After 10 years of courtship, the collection was purchased in 2012 at a price low enough for it to be regarded virtually as a donation by Webb. The collection was, in its day, the finest private collection of 19th century brass instruments in Britain. Although what Webb had collected for some 50 years, the bulk of the collection was acquired in less than a decade in the early 1980s. It has the character of a rapidly assembled collection, effectively built up in a short time with whatever happened to come onto the market, with multiple examples of some instrument types and the absence of other types. The instruments date almost entirely from the long 19th century, and the collection is particularly strong in British instruments, but with significant French, German and Italian examples. The regime at the Conservatoire substantially realises John Webb's vision for the collection in the 1990s, when he planned for it to be housed in the Royal Academy of Music. The historically important instruments have received professional conservation treatment. Instruments are available for loan to exhibitions, and the whole collection is available for research by RCS staff, students and visitors. A significant number of 19th and early 20th century instruments are available for period music performance. What started as a self-indulgent passion of a gifted and complex character can now make an organological contribution on the international stage. This serpent, made by Thomas Key of London, is unusual in having 14 keys. The 6 tone holes normally covered by the fingertips each have their own key, and there are 8 other keys to help playing chromatic passages. I think that 14 keys is the largest number ever put on a serpent. Despite the advantages for good intonation, I think these are definitely outweighed by the problems of maintaining a tight seal on 14 key pads. This is a Quinticle or Tenorophyclide. It was made by Hallmark in Paris, and it was invented at the same time as the normal bass ophiclide in 1817. However, it was replaced sooner by valved brass instruments. This particular example in the Webb collection was made by Hallmark, or either the inventor or the inventor's son, who used the same name. In Britain, the bass trombone was pitched in G. The G bass trombone was used for over a century and is characterised by the handle, which is used to reach the further slide positions. Some people regard the handle as being cumbersome, but in fact players of the G trombone revel in the arm and wrist movements as they nip around the slide. This particular example was made by Antoine Courtois in Paris in 1870. It was supplied to the Royal Italian Opera at Covent Garden. And it was also used more recently in the landmark recordings by the Wallace collection of the Kitharthur Band repertoire, where it was used to telling effect. This is also a G-bass trombone. It was made by Rudel Cart in 1892, in fact made by their master craftsman Charles Atwood Goodison, whose monogram is stamped at the top of the slide. It's a compact instrument, and this is achieved by having quadruple slides. This halves the amount of slide movement needed to reach different positions, but despite the advantages, it was not a commercial success. This is one of 6 slide trombones known, made by Adolph Sax. This one was made in 1873. Everyone who plays it comments enthusiastically on its qualities. Although it looks like a standard French model trombone, often termed a pea shooter, it is in fact slightly larger bore than the average. This may mean that it's intended to be played as a third trombone in sections of 3. This euphonium, or bass sax horn, is pitched in C. It was made at a time before the E-flat and B-flat instruments had completely displaced the F and C instruments. The inscription says J.H. Ebblewhite, maker, London. Ebblewhite is not known to have operated an instrument making factory, so this was probably imported from France and sold with his name on it. This French horn, with 3 Pyrenees valves, was made by Adolphe Sax in Paris in 1853. Sax had fallen out with the Distin family, who had been his dealers in London, and appointed Rudel, Rose and Cart as dealers instead, and their name is on the bell as well as Sax's inscription. Webb bought this instrument from the dealer Tony Bingham as a Christmas present for himself in December 1983. The Royal Conservatoire of Scotland recently lent this to the Musical Instrument Museum in Brussels for their exhibition celebrating the bicentenary of Adolphe Sax in 2014. This König horn is a further instrument from the great maker Antoine Courtois, who invented this model of instrument in 1855. It's essentially a sax horn and French horn rack, and it's built to be played with the right hand on the valves and the left hand supporting the bell. This example was made in 1866 and is pitched in F, half the tube length of the French horn in F, and it has crooks for E flat, D, D flat and C. It also has a Courtois mouthpiece, which could well be original. This piece of tubing is a dummy. It's just there to make it look more like a French horn. This elegant instrument is a vocal horn or concert horn made by Rudel Cart & Company in 1890. The model was introduced in 1862 and is pitched in C to allow playing of vocal parts with piano accompaniment using a normal brass fingering. It has a narrow mouthpiece receiver on a French horn, and this too has a mouthpiece which may well be original. Following the modest success of the vocal horn or concert horn, Bouzin Company introduced the ballad horn, same principle. Both these instruments were intended for domestic music making. This was introduced in 1868, but this particular example dates from 1925 and is the last ballad horn known to have been made. It also has a crook for B flat to allow it to be played in bands. This is the Hallmark solid silver slide trumpet by Köhler, which I mentioned earlier. It dates from 1860 and belonged to the most prominent trumpet player in Britain in the second half of the 19th century, Thomas Harper Jr. It has It's pitched in F, it has a crook for E, crook for E flat, crook for D, and a crook for C. It also has numerous tuning bits and two mouthpieces which belong to it. The first is beautifully decorated silver mouthpiece. The second one is wooden, the same dimensions more or less, and probably intended for winter playing. This slide trumpet has quadruple slides. The tubing goes round in an extra loop here, and two slides move when the player moves their fingers here. Because of the quadruple slide, the lowering of pitch for any given finger movement is double on a normal slide trumpet. It was invented by William Wyatt about 1890 and has his name on the bell, though it was actually made by William Brown and Sons shortly after 1890. This is another instrument with dummy tubing. All the tubing from here round to there is not part of the windway. This was an ingenious improvement to the slide trumpet, but it came at a time when the instrument was falling out of use and being replaced by valve trumpets. This valve trumpet by Charles Borromée Maillon dates from 1856 or earlier. It has double piston valves and they're operated by push rods in sprung tubes. Double piston valves with push rods are known as system Bell's valves from their long use in Belgium, though the concept actually originated in Saxony. According to the inscription, this is the Webster trumpet. It was made in 1927 by Rudel Carton Company. And the Webster trumpet was the name given to a model of trumpet with a so-called conical bore. It has a narrow mouthpiece receiver. That goes into the second valve, then into the first valve, then over into the third valve, then via the main tuning slide to the bell. It has 8 slide legs, therefore, and each one is slightly larger in bore than the previous one. This means that when valves are used in combination, there is not as much cylindrical tubing as there is with a conventional trumpet. Because of the narrow mouthpiece receiver, a Webster trumpet needs a specific mouthpiece. This is one such. It has a cornet-like stem and a trumpet-like cup. This instrument plays beautifully. Richard Wagner's opera Lohengrin calls for 10 trumpets playing on stage, all natural trumpets and pitched in different tonalities. This Lohengrin trumpet has a shank for F and 3 crooks with it. It was sold by Samuel Arthur Chappell of London in 1883 or earlier, and it was originally sold to the Her Majesty's Theatre in London, but later transferred to the Royal Italian Opera at Covent Garden. This magnificent keyed bugle was made by John Augustus Curler of London, and it has hallmarked silver fittings. The hallmarks allow us to date the instrument to 1835. This is a time when the keyed bugle was at the height of its popularity in Britain. This lovely little keyed bugle, it's pitched in E flat. The smaller model of bugle was rarely used in Britain, unlike the United States, But one or two examples survive, including this example by Wigglesworth of Otley, a small town in Yorkshire. This very unusual instrument is a cornutum. Two surviving examples of the cornutum are all that we have. It was patented by Gisborne of Birmingham, and it's equipped with very unusual valves. You can see the tuning slides go in and out to the same side of the valve and the same side as the main tubing. It was advertised as the drawing room cornupian, so evidently intended for domestic use, and it's pitched in C. It has with it crooks for B flat, A flat, G and F. The bore profile is intermediate between that of a cornet and a flugelhorn, so it's really a kind of instrument all on its own. The Cornetta Piston was developed in France. Originally it had two valves. Two valves are all you need for playing most of the range of the instrument, and it's very light to hold. This particular example has just its shank for A, but originally it would have had shank for B flat and crooks for lower tonalities. This little instrument was made by Meriel Fils at Caen. The French Cornetta Piston is distinguished by its narrow mouthpiece receiver. On the other hand, the British cornupian is distinguished by a wider mouthpiece receiver. The cornupian was exclusively used in Britain. It very often has a single key, so-called clapper key, which allows trills to be played on any note, not always easy with valved instruments. Typically it has protective caps for the valve touches. This example was made by Charles Pace of London, and it says on it, "Handlers improved." I don't know who Handley was, but the improvement is quite clever. It has, instead of terminal crooks, it has tuning slide crooks. The one in the instrument is for B flat, then there are crooks for A flat, G and F. This principle is quite well known for the Inventions horn, the model of French horn with tuning slide crooks, but it's very rarely found on cornet type instruments. This little instrument is both an early example of soprano cornet in E flat and an example of an instrument with disc valves, patent lever valves invented by John Shaw and made exclusively by John Augustus Curler in London. This example was made about 1854. You can see that the windway has a very gentle curves, no sharp angles. It's a very free-blowing instrument and works very well when well regulated. Maintenance can be a problem, and the difficulty of maintaining the discs airtight was probably the reason why they stopped making them. Rotary valves are not usually associated with British makers, but several makers produced them in the 1860s. This example is by Henry Destin, and it has string action rotary valves. You press a lever down and the string wraps round the rotor and rotates the valves. This elegant pushrod actuation of rotary valves was invented and patented by Joseph Hyam in 1857. Other makers used a similar principle. The springs are mounted inside these casings here. In this instrument, the player's fingers need move only 9 millimeters to operate a valve. This unusual instrument was made by Louis David in Paris. It was patented in 1866 by David and has so-called helical valves. In most valve instruments, there are either pistons going up or down and rotors turning round. This instrument has both. As you press a valve down, the piston inside rotates as well as going up and down. This allows the number of coquilles or passages in the pistons to be reduced. However, these small advantages don't outweigh the sluggishness of the valve action, and this is probably the only surviving helical valve instrument in existence. Other instruments from the Webb collection will be used by the Wallace collection in the live-streamed concert. The Royal Conservatoire of Scotland is a great place to study, whether undertaking a postgraduate research degree or visiting to examine particular instruments. A list of the John Webb collection and other historic musical instruments is available online. And the Minim website has photos and brief descriptions of everything.